Hello, I'm Dave Waddington, and I'd like to welcome you to this free webinar on remote and virtual audits. We'll just give it a few seconds for the last few people to dial in. I can see that the number of attendees is increasing quite rapidly at the moment, so we'll start this session in about the next 30 seconds. Okay, I'd like to start by thanking you for joining me today, and I have to say that I'm really surprised by the response we've received with over 500 participants. In fact, it's 516 participants have registered for this event. And I really think that's a reflection of the challenges that we're facing at the moment, trying to assure the safe supply of good quality medicines. And I really do hope that this webinar will help both our auditors who are planning to perform remote audits and also auditees who are looking to host and try and make those audits as efficient and effective as possible. The remote audit process is equally applicable not only to our external audits, where we may be auditing maybe commercial manufacturers or suppliers of IMPs, but also for our internal audit processes, maybe our global audits, our corporate audits, and even due diligence audits or for cause audits. So we'll keep that in context as we run through the session today. I'd just like to remind you that the session today is being recorded and will be made available after the conclusion of the session. And all participants today are in listen-only mode, so you can't actually communicate directly with us. So just moving on to today's agenda. So I'm going to start off with a quick five-minute introduction. Then I'm going to play a pre-recorded 15-minute session looking at my feedback, if you like, from the remote and virtual audits that we've conducted so far at NSF. I'm then going to run into a live question and answer session, which will be about 10 or 15 minutes. And we'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, your concerns. And there's ways you can share those with us, depending upon which device that you're actually on. So on the screen, I've got representations of the different types of devices you may have connected with. So on the left-hand side is a typical phone. And on the phone, you'll see at the bottom, if you're using the app, there's a question mark. And if you click on that question mark, it'll open up a question window where you can simply submit a question to us. On the middle one, we have an iPad or a tablet version where you should be able to click again on the question mark, this time at the top of the screen, and it opens up a window. The trick with tablets is you have to click into the area that says enter message to actually type, and that will show the keyboard. And finally, on laptops or desktops, there should be a question mark at the side of the page. And again, if you click that, it'll open up a communication window. And we'd like you to submit questions at any point during today's webinar, and we will collate those and answer them at the end. So a very brief introduction about myself. I'm an executive director at NSF, where I've been based for the past 3 years. And prior to that, I spent 30 years in the pharmaceutical industry. And here's just a quick resume of my areas of expertise and my involvement. So I'd like to kick off today's session with a quick straw poll of the audience. So I can see we've got over 270 dialed in now. So what I'd like to do is to launch a quick poll and just to see what your experience is in relation to remote audits. So this may be looking at the remote audits you've conducted or been subjected to. So I'm going to launch a poll and just simply ask the question, how many remote audits have you actually conducted or actually been subject to? So if you could simply click one of those check boxes, and we should get some feedback coming in. And I'll just leave this poll open for a few minutes to let you vote. That's fantastic. Lots of answers coming in. Okay, I'll close the poll at that point. And what we can see there is if I share the results of the poll, that the majority of the participants today have either had a small number of remote audits that they've either conducted or been subjected to, or none at all, so fairly new to this subject. And then we have a few individuals, so 2% have had 10 or more, so a lot of expertise in this area. So that's really great to see. So thank you very much for sharing that information with us. So I'll just hide that poll. And now what I'd like to do is to share with you the pre-recorded session that we have. And if you just bear with me 1 second, and I will bring this up now. Just a little bit of information about the video that I'm going to share. For some devices, and particularly on iPads or tablets, when it goes into and out of this video, it can kick you out of the meeting. And if it does, simply just come back into the meeting using the meeting ID you used. So I'm now going to load that up. And it'll just take a few seconds for it to actually come on. So just bear with me. I'm now going to share with you the experiences NSF have gained over the past 5 months conducting both desktop reviews and remote audits. Back in March, we developed a simple 4-step approach to conducting remote audits. The first step is a risk-based assessment, and in this step we collate information about the site and the products being produced and determine whether it's actually safe in the first instance to conduct a remote audit. The second step is then looking at a remote PQS assessment, and this is looking at all the key master documents as part of the quality system. The third step is then the interviews with subject matter experts, which is the remote audit itself, and here we're looking for evidence of implementation and adherence to those key PQS elements. And then finally, the fourth step is really the decision point as to whether an on-site audit will be required in the future. My thoughts on this were shared in a free webinar which is available on YouTube, and if you haven't seen it yet, it's highly recommended to watch it. As an auditor, when considering remote audits, there's some perceptions that we need to be aware of, and these certainly centre around the concern of accessibility to the facility. Will we be able to obtain that objective evidence that we require to be able to determine whether the site is actually operating to the appropriate standards or not? And after all, we've always visited sites, so isn't that the only way we can do this? Isn't that the correct way? And even within companies, do our policies allow for remote audits in the first instances? And also there's that concern about whether remote audits are going to be acceptable to regulatory authorities. And it's certainly been interesting to see over the past few months that quite a number of regulatory authorities themselves have been carrying out remote audits or desktop reviews of the facilities. And after all, in these unprecedented times, we haven't really had a choice. So if we want to continue supply of commercial products, or indeed if we want to commence trials of new drugs, then we have to think innovatively around how we can conduct the audits of the facilities that are key to these supply chains. So what are NSF's experiences of completing remote audits to date? Well, I'm pleased to say that we've conducted well into double figures of remote audits. And those audits have actually been carried out on fairly much a global scale. So we've carried out audits in Asia, quite a number of audits in Asia, in North America, and also in Europe itself. And those audits have been conducted of API facilities, solid dose facilities, and even into cell banks and biological facilities and aseptic processors. And so far, I'm really pleased to report that the sites being audited have been incredibly willing and flexible to accommodate audits. They realise the challenges that lie ahead for us and want to make sure the process has been working appropriately. And yes, we have conducted virtual tours of facilities, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And actually, virtual tours do work. So with the right planning, you can actually get some really good access into facilities. And we've also found that we're conducting our audits on behalf of clients, and our clients are actually getting more involved in the audit process themselves. And particularly as a lot of the audits we conduct are for QP certification and acceptability of facilities within Europe, our clients' QPs are actively getting involved and seeing parts of facilities and processes they haven't really had access to previously. If we take a look now at the remote audit process itself, and here I have a pictorial view of a process, and it's similar to an on-site audit, but it is also subtly different. So what we're finding is that the upfront work you have to do for remote audits is actually quite intense. So typically we're finding that we're having to do a lot more preparation work, a lot more talking to our clients and the sites that are being audited. And typically we're having between maybe 3 and 5 meetings. And part of that is agreeing what the process is going to look like. A lot of discussions around confidentiality and how we're going to share information, what technology platforms to use, quite importantly, the scope of the audit, and how we're going to communicate between us and how the timings of the audit are going to work. And often there we're seeing the discussions are not only with the site and the audit team, but also with more bigger companies with their global groups as well, to look at the acceptability of remote audits. The other key areas of difference is we conduct a remote assessment of the master documentation prior to actually establishing the audit agenda. And this may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but actually it's the information you see from the master documentation that then really drives those areas you want to look at in more detail with the subject matter experts, and therefore actually establishing the agenda. The opening and closing meetings for remote audits are actually very similar to what you'd normally experience when you're on site. But the remote audit itself and the interviews with the subject matter experts, this takes a lot of work and a lot of preparation to make sure that you've got the right subject matter experts with the right information available at the right time. And our experience here shows that with remote auditing, the maximum period of time that we can audit in any one day is really around about 4 hours. So our auditors are reporting back that it is actually quite an intense experience conducting a remote audit through a screen, through video conferences, compared to when you're at a facility. We've all been there at facilities when you're halfway through reading complex documents and you're maybe losing a bit of concentration, and it's just good then to get up and walk around and continue with your tours. Well, of course, with remote audits, you don't have that option of being able to jump out and look into other areas. So our auditors are reporting it is quite an intense experience. So let's take a look now at the experiences we've had on conducting virtual tours. And I have to say, I have been very, very surprised at how successful these have been so far. But the success is largely due to preparation. And I think the key difference with virtual tours compared to when you're at the facility is you don't want to conduct your complete walkthrough of the whole facility. If you do, it's going to take an incredibly long period of time. So a better strategy we've found is from knowledge of the process, knowledge of the key risk areas of the facilities, and maybe a review of the floor plans from the site master file. You can really target the areas you want to look at. And then through the virtual tour is only look at those key areas. Now, I know there's been a lot of publicity about people using technologies such as Google Glasses, and there are other brands available. And yes, they do work very successfully. But also you can just use a very simple webcam or phone and get very good imagery from the site. Some key messages here is it's really important to test connectivity in advance. So there will be areas of the facility where the Wi-Fi coverage might be quite poor, and it's good to know in advance where those are. And also it's good to have a backup strategy. So if the person conducting the virtual tour loses connectivity, it's great to have a backup way of communicating with them through something like WhatsApp or Skype or another media. The advantage, of course, of taking phones into the facility is you can also take still images. So when looking at maybe production equipment and vessels, you can take photographs of the room logbook, the device on the vessel, and you can record its identification number, maybe a label or the calibration certificate that goes with it. And then you can follow those up as part of a normal audit afterwards. There is a lot of debate that normally happens with companies on acceptability of being able to use footage within those facilities themselves. So if conducting remote audits, be prepared for some long discussions here. When conducting interviews with the subject matter experts, again, the preparation is very important, as it will be for the opening and closing meetings. So here we need to think about what technology platform is going to work best for the site. And what I normally do is leave it up to the site to decide which platform they want to work from. And that's quite important because as you move around the globe from Asia to North America, different regions and different companies will accept different platforms. And it's all too common to find if you try and impose a platform, for example, Microsoft Teams on a company, their own firewalls may block that particular application working. So I find I get more success by using the standard platform from the site. It is great though to test this in advance to make sure it works and works successfully. I've even had the experience of conducting 3 days worth of an audit very successfully in one meeting room, simply switched to another meeting room for the final day on the other side of the corridor, and we didn't have access to the cameras, they just didn't work. So it's really important again just to test the connectivity, and also make sure that when you're carrying out the interviews, if something happens and the connection drops, then don't panic. It's just very easy to re-establish that connection and carry on with the interview. But also when trying to conduct an audit, don't underestimate the time it takes for live translation. So auditors should be used to this when auditing maybe in a different language, in China, in Taiwan and Korea, but it does take a lot longer when auditing remotely, so just make sure you do factor that in. When reviewing documentation, I find it works very well to ask the facility in advance via email or other means of not only the documentation that you want to review, but why you want to review it. So what information are you specifically looking for? And hopefully that avoids confusion when the documents are presented to you. And also really try and work with the site so that they're not having to copy many documents unnecessarily. So I try and just say to the site that, well, this is information I need to see. Please present it to me in the easiest way. So for example, if you want to look at an executed batch record, which is 100 pages long, I don't need the whole record putting into a PDF and presenting to me if I only need to look at maybe 2 or 3 key pages of the record. And by doing that, it's quite easy then for the site maybe to present that document to a camera, and you can just review it live on screen as a paper copy rather than creating a lot of additional work for the facility. I've also had a lot of success at just looking at raw data. So I've even carried out data integrity reviews where we've looked at information submitted in an IMPD, taken that back through the LIMS system and looked at the electronic data of the test results in the LIMS system, then taken that back to the HPLC, the chromatography data handling system, and looking at the raw data in the system. And I'm mentioning this because it's quite easy for sites to share through screen share direct access into these systems. And again, if you can highlight in advance what information you want to see, it then just allows the site to prepare and make sure they've logged into all the appropriate systems. So it's a real collaborative effort, I find, works very successfully here in making the audit run a lot more smoothly. So what does the future hold for us? Well, certainly the feedback we've been getting from our clients is they have been really surprised at how successful the remote audit process has been so far. And we're all getting a lot more conscious of the need to reduce our travel, the environmental impact associated with that, but also consideration of the cost and time of flying around the globe to conduct maybe a 1 or 2 day audit, which involves 3 days worth of travel. And my personal opinion is that with an appropriate risk-based approach, I believe there is a future for remote audits even when we can freely travel. And I think for maybe early phases, phase 1, phase 2 clinical trial manufacturers, and maybe for supporting those ongoing commercial facilities that we have been to on a number of occasions, there may be an appropriate place for remote audits in the future. So I think this is going to be a growing area and an area we're going to become a lot more comfortable with in the future. Well, I hope you found Hi, so welcome back. I hope you found that to be informative. And just apologies, a few people seem to be experiencing some issues, some technical issues in terms of seeing the footage and hearing that recording. So we will make sure that the information is available and the full webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. So now just picking up on some questions, and we've had a flood of questions coming in, so thank you for those. And just picking up some of those key question areas. And there's quite a number of questions around confidentiality and sharing confidential information. And I think from my experiences, there's 2 ways of dealing with this. Perhaps the better way for the site to deal with it is to establish a secure documentation room. So providing a secure reading room where those documents are locked, there's read-only access, and the auditor can only access them via a secure password. From an auditor's perspective, then perhaps the better way is to be able to have those documents available to them via a secure transfer platform. And we certainly use one called MoveIt, and there's a number of other encrypted document transfer platforms available. Either way is perfectly acceptable. However, you really do have to make sure that your non-disclosure agreements, your confidentiality agreements are in place, and that the I guess the auditor, there could be a commitment that they will delete any copies of documents that they have made. Another area which is generating a lot of great questions is about tours of facilities. So questions along the lines of cameras aren't allowed in facilities, companies ban the use of cameras in facilities. And we've had discussions, extensive discussions with sites being audited around this area. And the first thing I'd just say is try to understand why cameras aren't allowed in the facility in the first place. So if it is purely a safety measure, because it's an API facility, it's a solvent area, and there's a flame-proof area, then absolutely that presents a challenge. But often companies have policies where cameras aren't allowed in because they don't necessarily want employees with cameras and phones in production areas, or maybe the service engineers in the areas. So it's also worthwhile exploring and see if there's any compromise that can be allowed there. The other question there is relating to, is it acceptable to do pre-recorded tours? And I think that's a really good question. From an auditor's point of view, you would have to make sure that a pre-recorded tour does cover the specific areas you want to look at. I mean, the big benefit of doing a tour which you're directing is you can obviously, as an auditor, direct the auditee to the specific processes and pieces of equipment that you want to look at in more detail. And just a few other points about access into facilities. You obviously wouldn't expect access into maybe the aseptic zones where you wouldn't normally physically go during an audit themselves. And we've actually very successfully conducted audits by the auditor presenting a camera to a window looking into the particular manufacturing zone. And I think some other things just to consider there is, I mentioned earlier that it's good to have a backup strategy. So if you can't communicate with a person in the facility, that by maybe the immediate headset they're wearing, then you can communicate via another media. But also the facilities can be quite noisy. So it's quite helpful to have a noise cancelling microphone available just to quieten down some of the background noise in the production area. But certainly we've found most of the companies we've dealt with so far, once they understand the need of what we want to see, will work very closely with us to find a way of sharing the images from within the facility. So directed to targeted areas by live video feed is by far the best. If not, pre-recorded and identifying what we want to look at is perhaps the next best, or then moving down to providing photographs of the particular equipment, particular areas we want to look at. So a few questions coming in around timing. So audits typically take of facilities between 3 and 5 days when we're visiting the facility. How long would that take by remote audit? It's a good question. We've been finding that remote audits are taking slightly longer for the auditor, but we are making a commitment to the site that's been audited that we will only take up the allotted audit time. And what I mean by that is if it's a 3-day audit, it may take us 4 days to complete the whole audit, but only 3 days would be face-to-face with the site. One of the challenges for the auditor is time management. So when you're at a facility for those 3 days, you may be working from 9 in the morning till 5 in the evening, and it's a fixed period of time that you're actually on the site. The danger with a remote audit for the auditor is you have a look at 3 deviation reports. Why not look at 4, 5, 6, or 7? So if you're not careful, you can get a scope creep. So it's important that the auditor has their audit agenda and does try and stick to that as closely as possible. What we have been getting feedback on, though, is the remote audit process. And somebody asked the question, what's the difference between a desktop audit and a remote audit? A desktop audit is one where you really are in your office on your own, reviewing master documentation or completed documentation without any interaction with the site. A remote audit combines that desktop review with that remote audit involving those subject matter experts and maybe including virtual tours, etc. And our auditors are reporting back that when they're carrying out their remote reviews of documentation, they're finding it very time efficient. So because they're not being disturbed and they can put aside the time to do those reviews, then they find it to be quite an efficient review process. So one good question here is, are we concerned that by remote audits, sites may be able to hide things that they don't want us to see? That's obviously a very good question. I think if we look at that when we're auditing facilities, quite often when we're in a facility, they're not in production. so we can't actually live audit our particular product or our particular service that's been provided for us. So even on our face-to-face audits, we have a limited view. And of course, when we're walking around a facility, the auditees can direct us to what they want us to look at. So they can manage that audit process when we're at the facility. Very similar when we're doing the remote audits, we can be directed to look in areas that they specifically want to show us. And I think when we're looking at remote audits, and in fact when we're looking at on-site audits, we have to have that in the back of our mind, and we can have some coping strategies where we can specifically ask to look live if possible at certain areas. But I guess that's all part of the culture of the organisation we're dealing with and what our feeling of acceptability of that organisation is. And just looking at one final question here and looking at time zones. This is a particular favourite of mine. So I carried out an audit of a company based in South Korea. And what we agreed is, because of the time difference, that my sort of 6 o'clock in the morning was 4 o'clock in the afternoon there. So we actually did the audit between 4 and 6 o'clock their time, which was then between 6 and 8 o'clock my time. And instead of doing an audit, which would be a 2-day audit back to back, bearing in mind the comments I made that it's really difficult to do more than 4 hours in one day, we simply split the audit up into 5 2-hour segments spread over a week. And we found that to be very time efficient for myself as the auditor, but also the site being audited, because it was only occupying 2 hours per day late in the day. And it actually gave an opportunity between each day's auditing for the site to translate any documentation that was required for the next day, and even to come back with some maybe misunderstandings or clarifications of points. So we've had lots and lots and lots of questions, lots of interesting areas. What I will commit to is that we will respond to these questions. So we will group them together and either respond, I will personally respond either individually to people, or through posts on LinkedIn and other media, we will then publish some general responses. Now, I think this area is an area which, as I mentioned, is going to continue in the future. I'm certainly getting some really positive feedback from sites being audited and clients who were auditing on behalf. And I think there is a place for remote audits in the future. So just really to conclude today's session, for any of you that haven't already downloaded it, I'll just bring your attention to our NSF app, where you can get access to free resources, so a free library of information, including some of the information related to remote and virtual audits, and all updates on current legislation and guidance. And also, we've recently launched an IVD version of the app, specifically for those areas or those companies working in the IVD world. And finally, it just remains for me to thank you for dialing in and for raising some quite challenging questions there, and some great questions. If after this webinar you do think of any further questions, then please do contact us on farmermail@nsf.org, and you can go in via our website or our app to find other free resources. So once again, thank you very much for your attention and participation today. And with that, I'll bring the webinar to a conclusion. Have a great day.